teaser. So you guys are sort of pulsating. I think I'll be all right. It seems to be fading. So I've been interested in many, many years in the evolution of language. And for anyone who works in this field, you're immediately faced with this traditional battle between Chomskyan and Darwinian viewpoints, where Chomsky has quite famously said that animals don't have language, that language is something that's human unique and it really makes us humans, where Darwin basically saw many aspects of animal communication as either related to or precursors of human language. And when I entered the field 20 years ago, this opposition loomed very large. But I think today we're starting to overcome this and see what the virtues are of both the Chomskyan and the Darwinian perspectives, and that's what I want to introduce you to today. How we can make sense of the evolution of language from a Darwinian perspective without losing the insights into the nature of language that have been part of the cognitive revolution. So I think the first key step is to recognize that language is not one thing. Language is actually a suite of capacities. It's in a sense, it's a set of tools that working together give us this amazing capacity to communicate our thoughts with one another. But some of those tools are very basic and shared with other animals. Others may be unusual, shared with a few other species, but not many. And a few might in fact be uniquely human. So the fact that language as a whole is unique doesn't mean that we can't find multiple components of language that are shared with other species. And I've just listed a few of these here just to give you examples. So vocal imitation I'll talk about later. That's something that we humans share with birds and seals and elephants. Speech perception seems to be something very widely shared, the capacity to hear different vowels and consonants. Dogs and cats can do that, as well as many birds. Basically, most vertebrates that have been tested. And then we come to things like hierarchical syntax, which seem more plausibly to be unique to our species. But the basic story that I want to tell you today is captured by this metaphor that language is essentially built out of a whole set of building blocks, most of which, down here in this shared foundations part, are shared either widely or narrowly with other species. So in all of these different traits, we have lots of evidence showing that other animals can do these things. I'm not going to go through all the details. But on top of that, humans have a few unusual features, and I've called these the three S's: signal, syntax, and semantics. These things are unusual in humans relative to our nearest relatives, the chimpanzees. And on top of this whole set of building blocks, we have language. So yes, language is unique to our species, but that doesn't mean we can't study its evolution from a comparative perspective. So that's part one. That's the sort of cognitive move to break down this monolith of language into a set of component parts. And the other part, and this is the part that may be less familiar to you, is the Darwinian perspective on how to do evolutionary biology by doing comparisons among multiple species. So the idea is that given any particular trait, we can look at either our close relatives or more distant relatives and analyze the evolution of that trait by the pattern of similarities that we see. So let's start with the simplest kind of similarity, which is homology. Homologies are traits that are shared because of descent from a common ancestor. So for example, you and your sister might both have, let's say, dark hair, and that comes from the fact that your parents have dark hair. So that would be a case of an inherited trait. And examples of this would be the relatively large brains, the relatively large body sizes, the relatively long lives, the relatively prolonged childhoods, and the very good manual dexterity that we share with chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans, our nearest living relatives. That's because of the fact that our common ancestor with the apes had those abilities. Okay? So I think those are the easy ones to understand, homologies. But there's another set of similar traits. For example, I'm walking around on two legs here, and that's what birds do. If you go outside, you'll see pigeons walking on two legs. That's something that has evolved convergently, so in parallel between birds and humans. The reason we know that is that all of the species that are in between, so that are basically interspersed evolutionarily between birds and humans, are not bipedal. Okay? So what that tells us is not that this common ancestor of birds and humans was bipedal, but that we had two independent evolutionary events that led to bipedalism in Homo sapiens and in birds. Okay? And those, it's very important to draw the distinction between those two different kinds of shared traits, because these ones enable us to rebuild the past, so we can rebuild the structure of of our evolutionary history using homology. But these ones allow us to test hypotheses about why, about how exactly something works in terms of neural mechanisms, or why it evolved in terms of its function for, you know, why is bipedalism good? Well, for keeping your head high above the grass, et cetera, et cetera. We can test those hypotheses using these because these are independent data points. In convergent evolution, we have independent data points. So from a statistical point of view, these really are two independent things, whereas these basically all come from one single event. Okay, so that's going to be the subtext of everything that I say for the rest of this talk, and I'll give you examples of both homology and convergence as a way of seeing what we have in common with other animals and what we don't. Okay, so back to those three derived components, those three pillars of speech, syntax, and semantics. These, as I'll show you, these are unusual in humans, but that does not mean that they're unique. What I mean by derived here is that when we build a comparison with other apes, so chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, these are things that make humans unusual relative to chimpanzees. But in some cases, they are shared with other species. And for reasons of time, I'm only going to deal with two of these S's, the signaling and the syntactic component. We can maybe talk about semantics in the questions if you're interested. So what I want to do in today's talk is walk you through those two examples of speech and syntax and show you how we can take a comparative approach looking at other species to gain insight into how these unusual features of humans evolved. I think in the case of speech, it's a relatively clear story. I think we're not sure of anything, but I think we have very firm hypotheses and quite a lot of data. With syntax, I think we're very much still in the initial stages of the game, so I think we're much less certain, but at least I hope you'll walk out here with some food for thought. So let me just jump right into it. One of the core differences between us and our nearest relatives, like the chimpanzees or great apes in general, is that babies learn to imitate the sounds of their environment. By the age of 2, a baby is singing the songs that his mother sings and speaking the words that his mother and father speak. And that's something that no ape has ever learned to do. So apes have a set of innate vocalizations like screams and grunts that they make, that the chimpanzees make, but they do not learn to produce sounds from their environment. And that's most striking when you raise an ape in a human environment and they won't learn to say the words that they hear surrounding. So this is this has been repeated many times with many different ape species, and in all cases we find the same thing. Even with intensive training, apes don't learn to speak. They can't even say, you know, hello. They can do things like, ha, and that's supposed to be cup. Okay? So that's something that's derived in humans relative to our nearest relatives, and we want to explain the evolution of that. So how do we go about this? This is something that Darwin had already spoken about in The Origin of Species, and he offered two hypotheses. These are kind of two traditional opposing hypotheses. One is that it has something to do with the structure of our vocal tract, with the anatomy of vocal production itself. I'm going to deal with that first. And the second is that it has something to do with changes that occurred in our brain. They could both be true, of course, but let's just treat them for now as separate hypotheses that we can test. So this idea that the human vocal tract is unique to our species, and that's crucial for speech, is a very old one. It actually goes back to my thesis supervisor, Philip Lieberman, who pointed out that the larynx in humans has lowered relative. Normally the larynx is up high in the throat, and where you see it in a chimpanzee, it's right at the back of the mouth. So if the chimpanzee opens its mouth, you can see the glottis back there. In humans, of course, we have a low larynx, so that the vocal folds have dropped way down, and the tongue has been rearranged as a result. So we have this much more sort of square-looking tongue than in a chimpanzee. And what Philip Lieberman claimed is that that anatomy is crucial for our ability to produce the vowels that are seen in human speech. And the way he did this, he took a dead monkey, sliced its head in half. They made a latex cast of the vocal tract. They sliced that up and used that to build a computer model. And what they found, these E, A, and U represent the vowels of human female, adult human female, in the space of the first formant versus the second formant. So these are frequency here, and E basically has a low first formant, a high second formant, And this space represents the space that we find vowels in all the world's languages. What Lieberman found from his computer model of the monkey is that all of the sounds that it could produce were right around here, right in the middle. So they were basically all variants of okay? Now, the conclusion was that the acoustic vowel spaces of a rhesus monkey is quite restricted. These animals thus lack the output mechanism necessary for production of human speech. This was published in 1969, and it has had a huge influence on the field. In fact, if I ask you, how many of you think that the reason apes can't talk is because of something about the vocal anatomy? Just let me see a show of hands. Maybe you're being shy. I'm only seeing like a third of the hands going, okay, there's some more over there. This has made it onto The Simpsons. That's when I really got annoyed, that when Homer Simpson says the reason my monkey can't talk is because his vocal tract isn't right. So anyway, this is an old idea. When I came into the field, this was out there. And one of the first things we saw, so that would be the human vowel space in red here. One of the first questions I asked is, okay, if you take a dead animal, maybe this is what you see, but what if you look at living animals? And so we started to do x-rays of animals vocalizing. And what I'm going to show here is an x-ray of a dog barking. It's been slowed down so you can see it more carefully. This is the dog's jaw. This is the dog's this is the larynx here with the vocal folds. And the tongue is this kind of lump that you can't see very clearly. But watch what happens when this dog barks. That's the larynx. So when we first saw these videos, it's crystal clear what's happening. The larynx is being pulled way down in the throat. Every time the dog barks, he moves his larynx into a human-like position, pulling the tongue into a human-like position. And as soon as and we've seen this now in all the mammals that we've looked at. So monkeys, dogs, pigs, everyone lowers their larynx when they make these vocalizations. So that appears to be a mammalian homology, which means it's something that we share with other mammals by common descent, meaning that the vocal tract is actually much more flexible than you would think based on looking at a dead animal that's been formalin fixed. So when I saw this back in 2000, we published this, I thought, okay, the vocal tract can't be the main thing that limits vocalization, that keeps a dog from speaking. If there's a human brain in control, the dog should be able to talk with this vocal tract. But Lieberman didn't accept it, and neither did apparently the field itself. So more recently, I set out with two colleagues, Asif Ghazenfar at Princeton and Bart de Boer in Amsterdam, to do this very solidly. So basically what we did was repeat the Lieberman experiments, but now using x-rays of a living monkey actually moving his vocal tract around. And I'll give you one little example here. This is a monkey making a little grunt vocalization. And what you can see is, just like in the dog, the larynx pops down when he makes these grunt vocalizations and then pops back up. Okay? So what we did with this, we took a set of 100 vocal tract configurations, what we could actually see in these x-rays. We traced those. We used those tracings then to build a computer model that basically used the outline of the vocal tract to build a 3D model. And then from that model, we could predict the formant frequencies that the monkey could produce using those different vocal configurations. And what we found is that, in fact, the vocal space is much wider. So this is the Lieberman figure that I showed you before with the monkey with the human, and this is Lieberman's little model monkey. And here's what we found in our monkey. So the vowel space, if you actually look at a living animal, is much expanded relative to that of this Lieberman model. And what's more to the point, it's about the same size as the human vowel space. Of course, it's different because the anatomy is slightly different, but what this means is that monkey vowels would sound different from human vowels, but nonetheless, there would be a wide range of vowels that differ enough in quality that you could make an understandable speech, understandable speech out of it. And we did this in the boring, kind of correct way by doing paired comparisons between these simulated monkey vowels. But a better way to get this is to listen to the following simulations. So what I'm going to play you now is my wife's voice saying an English phrase. But what we've done is we've taken her formant frequencies and we've used those as a model for our monkey computer model, so that in a sense the monkey is doing the best it can with the vocal configuration that it's got to imitate speech. And I'm going to play you the monkey first. So what I've done here is used a simulated monkey sort of grunt vocalization played through our model. And here's what, well, see if you can hear what it's saying. Very good. Here's my wife. Now, this is her actual performance, but played with the monkey source, just so you don't get any unfair hits. And here's the monkey again. Okay, many of you yelled out what it is. I think it's pretty obvious that you can understand, even though the monkey doesn't sound the same as a human, you can very clearly hear the vowel content. And that's done only using what we actually saw monkeys able to do in our x-rays. So there's no training of monkeys or moving anything around. This is just what monkeys actually do. So what we conclude from that is that it's not the vocal tract periphery. It's not the anatomy of the vocal tract that keeps a monkey from speaking, or a dog or a cat for that matter, but rather something about the brain, something about the neural mechanisms that control this vocal tract output are crucial. And I think there's at least two neural components that we can put our finger on. One is that one of the things you need to do if you want to hear sounds and then remember those and then produce them yourself is you have to have strong connections between auditory cortex, where the perception happens and where these auditory templates are stored, and the motor cortex, so that you can then attempt to produce those. So I think these connections are crucial, but everything we know about cortical anatomy suggests that these kinds of auditory motor connections are present in monkeys and probably in chimpanzees. Therefore, I don't think these are novel. What does appear to be novel are a second set of connections, a second ingredient for vocal control, namely connections from the motor cortex down to the mechanism that's being controlled, namely the vocal tract. And what's been known for quite a long time from comparative anatomy studies is that if we look, for example, at a cat, cats have only indirect connections from their cortex onto inner neurons somewhere down in the brainstem, and then those inner neurons are what are actually controlling the motor neurons that control the larynx or the tongue or the jaw. Okay, so these are indirect. And what has occurred in humans, and this is true in other primates as well, what has occurred in humans is that we've got a novel set of connections directly from the laryngeal motor cortex onto the motor neurons that control the larynx. So we retain these ancient connections, which are probably responsible for our innate calls, like laughter and screaming. But in addition, we have these new connections, these new direct connections. So again, this is based on comparative neuroanatomy of humans comparing us with other apes, or other apes and primates, and all other primates look the same. So if you think back about what I said about convergent evolution, you realize, well, that's an N of 2, basically. We have all primates and humans. All the primates have the same trait. They share that from a common ancestor. So this is not a very convincing argument from a statistical point of view. We basically have one data point, ourselves. So the question then is, how could we test this direct connections hypothesis using a comparative approach? And of course, the good news, as I'm sure some of you were thinking, is, well, let's look at other animals that imitate speech. So chimps can't talk, but as I'm sure many of you are aware, many different bird species have the capacity, when raised by humans, to imitate human sounds. I'm just going to show you one example that's kind of entertaining to me. This was a mynah bird that I met in Italian-speaking Switzerland, in Ticino. It was sitting in a bar, and basically I walked in, and this bird starts speaking Italian. And what you'll hear now is me videotaping him. You'll hear me trying to get him going. And first he does a bunch of mynah stuff before he finally breaks into his Italian.
Buonasera. Come stai? Come stai?
Come stai?
Buonasera.
Buonasera. Buonasera. Buonasera.
So pretty convincing, right? My Italian friends say his Italian accent is much better than mine. And think about what a striking difference that is. If you take a chimpanzee and raise it in a human home, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't even say mama. And if you put a bird in the corner of a bar, it picks up the local language and uses it somewhat appropriately. Okay? So I'm sure you knew about talking birds. You might not know about talking seals. This is another much more unusual example. This was a seal named Hoover, who was basically, his mother died in birth. He was born into the arms of a fisherman in Maine, in the northeast United States. The fisherman brought it home and put it in the bathtub, and he and his wife raised this until it got too big. They called him Hoover because he ate so much. So this seal was named Hoover, and when he became an adult, or when he got too big, they brought him to the New England Aquarium in Boston, and there Hoover lived the rest of his life. Once Hoover became sexually mature, so several years after leaving the fishermen, he started getting interested in females and making the sounds that I'm going to play for you, to female seals. Okay? He also did it to humans, but... There it is again. So what you can hear very clearly is Hoover, hey, and then he's doing this, oh yeah, which is get over here with a main accent. So this is slightly clearer. Later on in his life, he got a bit clearer. So not only is he speaking English, but he's speaking English with a Maine accent, sort of a Maine fisherman after a couple of years. As I said, he's directing this at female seals, so the meaning is completely absent. He has as far as he's concerned, he's just making sounds that adults make. And I think this is actually typical of speech imitating animals. Anyway, so these and many other examples show us that other species do have this capacity to imitate sounds from their environment, and the current list of species amounts to 3 different bird clades, so parrots, songbirds, and hummingbirds, both clades of cetaceans, so both the toothed whales like dolphins and the baleen whales like humpback whales, some seals, both species of elephants, and at least a few species of bats, and then humans. That's the current list of known vocal production learning species on the planet today. There's probably more that we don't know about. But what this repeated convergent evolution shows us is a way that we can test hypotheses about why and how this capacity for vocal imitation evolved in our species. And if we go back to this direct connections hypothesis, the prediction is that in all of these species that are able to learn new sounds, they should have these direct connections from the motor cortex onto the vocal articulators, and those connections should be absent in non-vocal learning species. And that prediction has been tested now in 4 different plays, 3 of which are published, and in all cases, it upholds this direct projections hypothesis. So birds have a different vocal organ, it's down here, it's called the syrinx, but the motor neurons that control that syrinx are in this nucleus here. And birds that learn their song have direct connections down onto those motor neurons. Birds that don't learn their song, so many birds don't have a capacity for vocal learning, lack those direct connections. So what this gives us is a lot more evidence for this direct connections hypothesis, and it illustrates the way we can use a broad comparative approach to test hypotheses and go beyond just looking at other primates. Okay, so you might say, why do these direct connections, why does such a small difference matter so much? Here, the case where we understand it best is in the evolution of motor control, particularly the hands, because among mammals, we have quite big differences in the degree to which there are direct connections from motor cortex onto the neurons in your upper spinal cord that control your fingers. And in those species, for example, cebus monkeys, which have very strong direct cortical connections, they have excellent control over their individual fingers. So they can use their individual fingers the way we can as separate articulators. And those species that basically lack those direct connections, so squirrel monkeys, for example, just use their hands like a paw, like that, the same way that a cat does. And we can see this more broadly, that species like chimpanzees or capuchins that have strong direct connections have better motor control than species like cats or opossums, which use their fingers basically as a whole, as part of their paw. So what I think this illustrates is that what these direct connections give us, it seems like a relatively small change, but it gives you direct cortical control over the motor neurons that are actually acting things out. It's like, for the animals that don't have it, it's like being a puppeteer and lacking the string that controls your larynx and your vocal articulators. And what we have gained is that string that enables us to control that. Okay, so what I hope to have shown you is that it's not about the vocal tract anatomy, rather it's about details of the neural control of that anatomy, that we have this unusual capacity to imitate sounds. And I hope to have also shown you that this broad comparative approach is a really powerful way that we can approach questions about human evolution, even things that are very unusual in us. So these direct connections is our kind of standard hypothesis. At this point, that's something that had to evolve in our species in the last 6 million years since we separated from chimpanzees. Okay, so that's the sort of part that I feel relatively firm about, and now for the rest of the talk, we're going to swim out into the unknown territory of syntax. We've already heard something about syntax in Colin Phillips' talk, and I think it's a nice setup for the kinds of things we need to think about. I want to be very clear that when I talk about syntax, I don't necessarily mean linguistic syntax. So I put this little thing here to just as a reminder that syntax appears to exist in other aspects of human behavior, and music is probably the best understood example, where we can really show that there's a kind of hierarchical structure that's built up with the chords and notes and melody, and we use that when we're perceiving music. I think it's an open question to what extent music and language are using the same mechanisms or similar mechanisms or overlapping mechanisms, but at least we can say that at a surface level, there is such a thing as a syntax of music, and probably a syntax of ornament, and a syntax of dance, and a syntax of other things as well. So my use of the term syntax is quite broad and not tied specifically to language. But if we now let's start to play the same game. Let's ask about our nearest living relatives, the chimpanzees. And as I'm sure you all know, if you train chimpanzees on sign language, either using their hands to make signs or pushing on a keyboard, this is Kanzi pushing on a so-called Yerkish keyboard, apes can learn to communicate much more than they can do with speech, so they don't have the vocal output, but they certainly have many of the cognitive capabilities that you need to communicate via a symbolic system. But in these cases, what we see is that they still don't use complex syntax the way that anyone in this room does in any language of the world. Basically, the best example of this is Kanzi. He does a combination of hand gestures and pushing on this keyboard, and he does that in a rule-governed way. So, for example, he'll say, gimme, and then push on his keyboard, apple, or gimme tickle, meaning tickle me, or gimme grape. And he always does the gimme part first, and so he sort of puts the verb request first and the noun part second. So there is a simple syntax there, but basically that's as far as it goes. So that's more or less the level of a 2-year-old child, and that's where he stops. So in humans, of course, we go well beyond that, and just as an example of why hierarchical structure is so important, here's a relatively simple embedded sentence in English. The boy who kicked the dog chased the girl. And just to check if everyone's awake, who chased the girl? Anyone? The boy, right? Because you are Homo sapiens, you recognize that this part here in the middle, who kicked the dog, because you're Homo sapiens and you speak English, you recognize that this is essentially just a modifier of the boy. You might as well say the American boy chased the girl, okay? But if you think about this from Kanzi's point of view, if you think that language is essentially a string of words, that a sentence is nothing more than a string of words, Kanzi could say, hey, look, who chased the girl? The dog chased the girl. And you might say that after a few beers, or if I pushed you the way Colin was pushing you fast this morning, because it says right there's the sentence, the dog chased the girl. Okay? And it's actually a quite peculiar fact that no one has to teach human babies, hey, pay attention to these embedded things. It's just something that comes very naturally to us, but it's not necessarily something that comes naturally to other species. Okay? So that's the kind of question, the structure dependence of syntactic interpretation and semantic interpretation as well is a key feature of language. Without that, we wouldn't be able to basically specify to any degree of accuracy that we need to anything that we can think about. We wouldn't have a full language. So how do we approach this? Linguists approach it by asking humans to do things like grammaticality judgments or make yes-no answers. It's a lot harder to do syntax with animals. And so our guide in all of the work I'm going to tell you about now is something called the Chomsky hierarchy, or the formal language hierarchy. And this was developed in Noam Chomsky's brilliant early years, basically in the late 1950s. It's a mathematical theorism, or formalism, that built on the work of Turing and Post and many others. And what Chomsky did was add some intermediate levels to give us this kind of nested hierarchy. You can think of this as a sort of roadmap to the complexity that you need in computational systems to get something like language. And I'm not going to go through all the details of this. What really matters is that the outermost circle represents anything that a Turing machine can compute, which by modern standards is anything that's computable. So anything that is computable is somewhere within this hierarchy. The innermost level is what are called finite state grammars, or regular grammars, and these are basically things that deal only with sequential structure, putting one thing after another. So these can build strings, these can build telephone numbers, et cetera, et cetera. But for the reasons that I just showed you in this example, they're not competent to capture the full richness of human language. And what Chomsky argued is that for that, you need something in between the full Monty of computability and these finite state grammars. And basically right now, everyone agrees that we go just a bit beyond these context-free grammars into the context-sensitive grammars. So somewhere up here. But for today's purposes, we can just say anything above this is super regular. And the question that we want to address is where are other animals in this Chomsky hierarchy? So the way we do this is by basically putting together sets of strings that we call them languages, but they don't have any meaning, so they're artificial grammars that build up artificial languages. And then we expose animals to these strings and ask them what they've learned. And there's different ways to do that. So these are two very basic grammars that have gotten a lot of attention in this field. I started off with these, the first experiment I did was using these grammars. And let me just walk you through this. So one is called AB to the N, and what it means, what it means is that I can do AB as many times as I want. AB, 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 AB. All of those are well-formed sentences of this particular grammar, AB to the N. Okay? So that's the easy one. That's at the innermost level of the Chomsky hierarchy. But now let's turn to a slightly more complicated grammar, and this is called A to the N, B to the N, because the number of A's has to be matched by the number of B's. Okay, so A, B, A, B, B, A, B, 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 but not A, B, B, B. Okay, everybody got it? It's pretty easy for humans to do this, but it turns out that this involves basically an ability to keep track of the number of A's and B's and to compare that number. And that's something that requires going beyond that innermost level of the Chomsky hierarchy. That requires a context-free grammar or above. Okay? So this was our first question. Can animals do both of these? Can humans do both of these? And can animals do both of these? We did this experiment with the humans. We just asked them to make yes/no judgments with a mouse. And with the monkeys, we used a head turn paradigm where we play them sounds that either fit the grammar or not. And we use their looks. When they look to something, they're surprised. That's an indication that it doesn't fit with what they'd heard before. And what we found was, let's look first at the sequential rule, the simple ABAB rule. Humans are very human adults are very easily able to say, yeah, if you do ABA or BBA or whatever, that's a violation. So humans reject the violations, they accept all the new things, and they're fine. They get the difference. Monkeys can do the same thing. So monkeys distinguish things that follow that grammar from things that fail. And that's great. That's important because it shows us that our monkeys are awake and paying attention, they're not stupid, and they're able to basically deal with these sounds and figure out what the rule is. But now we turn to this slightly more complicated hierarchical rule, this A to the N, B to the N rule. Again, humans have no problem with this, but the monkeys, in repeated testing, and we've tried this now in a bunch of different ways, the monkeys consistently fail. So they can't tell that AA, BBB is wrong. They don't seem to figure that out. They don't get this higher level grammar. Okay? So that led to the idea that maybe what monkeys are lacking is this ability to go to the super regular level of the Chomsky hierarchy. And just to give you one more example, so these aren't the only grammars that have been worked with. Here's a sort of interesting grammar called AB star A, which means as one A, as many B's as you want, followed by a final A. Okay, it's again a simple finite state grammar. What's interesting about it is you can make the B's as long as you want, so you can test memory. And in all the animals that we've looked at, in primates and also in birds, we find that in fact the animals are able to do this, and they're able to distinguish things that, for example, go B, A, B, or A, B star, and stop. They're able to reject all of those. So we've done this in squirrel monkeys, chimpanzees, marmosets. These are the people who did this: Andrea Ravignani, Ruth Songweber, and Stefan Reber. So that was good, but what this shows us is that monkeys can do the more finite state grammars. What we really are interested in is this harder question of can they go beyond? And for that we turn to a different paradigm which uses operant conditioning, where the animals are actually using a touch screen to make their answers. And the basic idea is very similar, except now we're using visual grammars. So we minimize the auditory demands, we minimize the working memory demands of our task, so that the birds simply see things like this, a string like this, And this would be A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B. You get the idea. And here's some A to the N, B to the N, A, B, B, A, B, B. And the animals first see a long string of these, so they just are presented with grammatical examples, so they know what they try and figure out what the pattern is. And then in the test, they see one that fits the pattern and one that violates it, and they have to peck the one that fits the pattern, and then they get a food reward. And they like to do this, and the pigeons will peck all day at this to get some grain. The other species that we work with is maybe not so familiar, so pigeons need no introduction. Kias are a New Zealand parrot. They're very intelligent, very large brains. They're kind of famous among New Zealanders for their mischievous, they like to take things apart and steal food from cats and do all this kind of clever stuff. And in our lab, they also turn out to be very clever. They're very able to learn various kinds of tool use and manipulation tasks. So we thought, okay, we're going to work with this smart species and a kind of normal bird and compare these. And our hope was, of course, that these smart birds would get this harder grammar, the one that the monkeys have been failing. And the people who did this work are Nina Sove Juliaust and Tecumseh Fitch. So the beauty of this way of doing things is that the choice paradigm gives us a lot of data. Okay? So what we can do is ask all kinds of questions about what the animals learned and what they didn't learn. And what we found, first of all, the pigeons basically kind of bottom out very quickly. They didn't seem to learn that much from it. But the kias are able to make all kinds of generalizations to new tiles, completely new colors, to rotated tiles. We can remove the color and they can do that. And crucially, we can extend the end from what they've been exposed to. So now instead of just being n is 2 or 3, we can make it 4 or 5, and the birds see these things, and we ask, do you recognize the grammar still? And then the other crucial thing is that we have mismatches where we say have 3 A's and 2 B's. Okay? All of these, the birds successfully do. So here's the actual data with the pigeons. You can see you're close to chance on the extensions and really at chance on the foils. The kias are perfectly able to do these extensions. So when you give them longer strings, no problem. They recognize the grammar and they answer correctly. So that was great. That's very exciting. But now when we turn to the mismatch, where we say have 2 A's and 3 B's, the kias fail. They fail completely. They're a chance. Even when we give them training, so we force them to look at these two things. One is matched, one is mismatched, and they have to peck on it, and when they peck on it, they get a peanut. They still fail to learn it. So it's a really remarkable, I mean, given how much they can do, given how smart they are, it's a really remarkable failure, because for humans, it's just so obvious. We just see it as symmetrical. You just can't help but seeing that the A's and the B's match. So then we started, because we have a lot of data, we can use a Bayesian approach. We can use model fitting to ask, for each individual bird, what is their model? What do they think is going on? What is the rule that they've actually learned? And this is work by Andrea Ravignani. I won't go through the details, but the basic idea is we have lots of different ways they can be doing it. These are our Bayesian hypotheses. And then for each bird, we ask for each of their answers, how consistent is it with that hypothesis? And then if they have a clear hypothesis, their answers should show us what that hypothesis is. Okay? It's a model selection approach. And what we found, let's turn to the pigeons first. We found that the pigeons are kind of all over the place. They have what appears to be different hypotheses for each bird. Some birds seem to be changing their hypotheses as they go along. They just don't have a very clear idea of what's going on. But if we turn to the kia, on the other hand, we find something quite remarkable. The kias are smart. Each kia figures out a very simple rule that enables it to answer the task. And that simple rule is either, and this is for the A to the N, B to the N, so the birds who have to peck when they see one of these A to the N, B stimuli. The rule is either, does it end with 2 B's? Or does it start with 2 A's? That's the rule that they learn. They don't look at the whole string. They just look at part of it, and they use that to make their answer, even when we force them to look. Okay? So kias are smart, and the question you might ask, if you go back to this, is why, given these kinds of stimuli, don't humans do this? Why do we pay attention to all this extra information that's kind of irrelevant, this global thing, when there's this nice little trick that our kias figured out that enables them to get a peanut every time? And I think this is something about our biases rather than our abilities. So we are very biased to pay attention to the whole string. If I told you this rule, you could all learn that. It's not that you can't do this. It's just not the way we tend to look at stimuli. Okay? So to wrap this up, all of this different artificial grammar learning experiments show us very clearly that various animals can learn various finite state grammars. That's not a problem. So sequential structure is something that they can deal with effectively and learn it quite quickly. But once it comes to going beyond that, even at this very simple A to the N, B to the N grammar, it doesn't seem to be something that they can do. Until very recently, until about 6-7 months ago, when this data came along. This is a beautiful study by Stan DeHaan, who was mentioned in the numeracy talk quite a lot. He's a brilliant guy, and he came up with this idea. This was done in his colleague Wang's lab up in Paris with monkeys. So the basic idea here is that you have a monkey doing sequences on a touch screen, and if you train the monkey on A, B, C, it has to do C, B, A. It has to repeat its steps backwards. They also did, if it sees ABC, it has to do ABC. And then they trained the monkey that if you see an A, if you're doing this grammar, do B, C, C, B, A. So basically the monkeys can generate that whole thing. And that's what's called a mirror grammar, and it's another grammar that's beyond the level that you can do with a simple finite state grammar. Okay? So what we see here, and the big news was that the monkeys can do it. These are the two individual monkeys learning these grammars, and you can see that it takes them a long time. It's a very slow, gradual process to get there, but they finally get there. They finally are able to basically do all these controls that I showed you the key is failing at, and really, so they really are getting this mirror grammar. These numbers down here are a bit misleading. You see 200, it says time 200. And you might think, oh, it takes whatever. Is that 200 trials to learn that? Is that 200 what? It's 200 days of working. And what that, since each block is 800 trials, what that amounts to is 80 to 160,000 trials. That's what we're looking at there for these monkeys to learn this task. So they can do it, but it takes a good part of their life. It's like basically going to monkey college, and it's a real pain in the ass, but they finally figure it out, okay? Now, and here's what I really like about this study. They also did the same experiment with preschool children. So these are 5 or 6 year olds. They go into the school. They show the kids the exact same task, and the kids learn it after 5 demonstrations. And they do all the exclusions. They pass all the tests, just like the monkeys, except in 5 minutes. Okay? So I think this is a beautiful example of probably in the animal world, absolutes aren't what are going to buy us something. So it's great that we now have an animal example that can do a superregular grammar because we can investigate the neural basis of that. But it's something that comes it's very difficult for a monkey to learn this, and it's something that just comes like that to us as human beings. So I want to end my talk by walking you through the hypothesis, my current working hypothesis about what is the difference that underlies human syntax in this broad sense that includes things like music. I call this the dendrophilia hypothesis, dendro meaning tree, philia meaning love. And the basic idea is that we humans are born with a love of tree structures, and that this is something that's typical of our species. It crosses domains, so we don't just do it in language, where we certainly do it, but we also do it in music, and even with these visual patterns I've been showing you. We divide strings up into chunks, and we put those chunks together into tree-like structures. And it's just something that we naturally seem to like to do. So that's why I call it dendrophilia. In order to do that, in order to build up these tree structures, you need computational abilities above that innermost level of the Chomsky hierarchy, this finite state or regular grammars. Okay, so that's the hypothesis. The question is, how does this work neurally? And why did we evolve that? Where did this come from? What is going on here computationally? And my basic idea is that essentially Broca's area, which has already been mentioned in passing as part of the inferior frontal gyrus, that has been known for a long time to play a role not only in speech, which is what Broca initially thought, but also in parsing syntax. So even when you're just hearing sentences, Broca's is activated. Patients who have Broca's damage have a hard time parsing up complex structures. It's particularly for complex nested structures, like the one I showed you earlier in the talk. And the computational hypothesis is essentially that Broca's area, this little part here, is serving as a stack or an auxiliary memory for the rest of the brain. So that when, say, the temporal cortex retrieves a word and builds up some little miniature tree structure, if it wants to put that into a larger tree structure, it uses Broca's area as the memory store to put that in. Okay? So let me walk you through, this goes back to the value of the Chomsky hierarchy. So what, in this finite state automaton, the innermost computational level, essentially what we have here is a machine that can compute any finite state grammar by reading through some input, so it's a string of inputs, A's and B's, say, and the machine itself hops from state to state, it hops from memory state to memory state, and then at the end it makes a yes-no decision, is that string part of my grammar that I code or not? Okay, so that's the simplest kind of computational machinery that can do anything very useful in the computer world, and these are used, for example, in lexicalizers when you're parsing computer code, and all that we need to add to that to get superregularity is a bit of auxiliary memory. And this was what Chomsky originally named this a push-down stack, and the analog is these stacks of trays that you have in cafeterias, where the last tray that went on is the first tray to come off. So the term stack refers to that kind of thing. So it's a very, very limited auxiliary memory, where you can only get off the last thing that you put on, but that's enough to do things like a mirror grammar, or this A to the N, B to the N grammar. So by taking this simple system and adding this one piece of extra machinery, which I posit is in Broca's area, you get this extra computational ability, okay? So what's our evidence that Broca's area is really playing this key role, the role of this stack in the formal language sense? Well, there's a bunch of, I think the clearest data comes from brain imaging studies, both in language and in music. And just to choose one example, this is a very beautiful study, again done by Stan Dehan and his colleague Christophe Padier, PNES paper. What they did was basically make more and more complex sentences. So they build up chunks of 2 words, 3 words, 4 words, 6 words, 12 words. And those were either simple things like the bank, red ball, or more complicated things up to full 12-word sentences. And these were presented to people to see, and basically all they had to do was read these and do a little distractor task. And what they found was, in particular, the inferior frontal gyrus, these areas where Broca's area is in blue, basically increase their activation. So you get more and more bold signal as you increase the size of the chunks. And they did some controls to show that's not semantics. So these areas in red also are activated by semantic complexity, but are not activated when you do Jabberwocky, which is basically kind of nonsense words. Okay? And similar things have been found in music. I don't have time to go through the methods, but again, this particular part of the brain seems to play a role in building up complex tree structures. Okay, so that's the evidence that it's playing a role like this in humans. Now, what about the evolutionary changes that had to occur between us and other primates to get this kind of activation? Well, the first thing is that our Broca's area is much larger. So chimpanzees or macaques do have a Broca's area, but it's very small. So this is a nice study done looking at the size of Broca's area in chimpanzees and humans. So this factor here shows how much larger a particular area is in chimps than in humans. So if you look, for example, at area 44, that's one part of Broca's area, it's almost 7 times larger in humans than in chimpanzees. So the cortical real estate devoted to Broca's area has expanded greatly. And for example, if you look at V1, primary visual cortex, it's only 1.8 times larger in humans than chimpanzees. So it's not that the whole brain has just exploded by seven times. In fact, particular areas of the human brain are much more expanded than others, and Broca's area is the most expanded area that we know. Okay? So we've got a lot more neurons in there doing whatever Broca's area does. The other thing is that the connectivity of this part of our brain is much enhanced relative to other non-human primates. This is a study by Jim Rilling using DTI to look at the white matter connections between this part of the brain and the rest of the brain. And what you can see is that Broca's area is basically connected to most of the parietal and almost all of the temporal lobe in humans. If we go to a macaque, there's basically almost no connection via this big, thick dorsal root to the parietal and none to the temporal cortex. Chimpanzees are somewhere in between. Okay, so not only has Broca's area expanded in size, it's greatly expanded in its connectivity to the rest of the brain. And there's another nice recent study that shows if you compare human connectivity and monkey connectivity, the areas that are the biggest mismatch are this area right here, basically Broca's inferior frontal gyrus, and this whole area of the temporal and parietal cortex that it connects to. So that's what these are, this so-called arcuate fasciculus connects to. Okay? So there's a lot of converging data coming back to this idea that Broca's is special in humans. It's not unique, but it's much, much more highly developed, both in terms of the number of neurons and their connectivity. And that's what leads me to this hypothesis that the way we achieve superregularity, the way we achieve dendrophilia in our species is basically by building up this Broca's area as the equivalent of a stack to store intermediate computations. And because I'm running out of time, I'm going to skip these, and I think I'll just come to my conclusions. So, first of all, from a computational view, IFG is another form of, the Broca's area is another form of working memory, so it's a mistake to say, oh, there's syntax and there's working memory. This is a particular type of working memory that plays a role in building hierarchies, and I think you needed both expansion in neuronal numbers and connectivity in order to achieve this kind of connectivity. Okay, so what I hope to have shown you today in today's talk is that we should look at a wide variety of vertebrates, not just limit ourselves to humans and chimpanzees, say, that the key determinants of speech are not our vocal apparatus, but rather our neural control mechanisms. I think we're starting to get a clearer picture of what's going on with human syntax. At least this one hypothesis about the role of Broca's area seems to be quite a solid bit of difference in us that we can start to talk about the evolution of. And my hypothesis for what it's doing is basically making us into dendrophilia, giving us dendrophilia, giving this love of building up tree structures. So it's not just the capacity to do that, it's also the proclivity, the desire to build up tree structures. And my idea is that Broca's is really the new computational aspect of this that goes beyond what we see in other non-human primates. And as always, I've named a lot of these people as I went, so I wouldn't have to end by talking about them all, but thanks to all the collaborators who did this work, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Fitch, for your excellent talk. And now we can have some questions from the audience.
First hand was right there. Oh.
First and last
Right.
Hi. Thank you so much. It was very interesting. I'm curious about the perspective, the neural maturation perspective in humans. So we know that LIFG develops rather late in humans, and there are some theories linking some dorsal pathways in LIFG and between Broca's area and vertebrates area to specifically